Welcome to the Aced It podcast, where we turn science into sense. In this very special season, funded by the Bureau of Justice Assistance, we provide 10 timely episodes with the hopes of helping listeners understand what we can learn from current research that will help correctional staff. And please note, we did not just guess at what correctional staff need to know. We traveled the country, interviewing individuals working in prisons and jails, and the topics of these episodes are exactly what they asked for. So, I'm Danielle Rudes, your host, and here we go. Let's talk about trauma-informed care in carceral environments or contexts. This important topic in corrections has caught our attention, so we are here to help you understand what it means and why it is important. Trauma-informed care is a critical carceral topic that, when practiced, attempts to protect the well-being of incarcerated residents by understanding their pre-existing and or their current trauma. Whether these residents are just transitioning into the prison or jail environment or have spent a long time already incarcerated, the proper use of trauma-informed practices can be beneficial for residents, but also for custodial staff. To fully comprehend the meaning of trauma-informed care, we must highlight the difference identified within correctional trauma-informed training to actual trauma-informed practices. In recent research conducted by Vaswani and Paul in 2019 titled, "It's Knowing the Right Thing to Say and Do: Challenges and Opportunities for Trauma-Informed Practices in a Prison Context," these scholars explore the perspectives of over 200 prison staff on their trauma-informed approaches. But before we jump right into filling the gaps between trauma-informed training and practices, let's first establish what trauma is. Trauma can be described as experiences which emotionally, mentally, or physically harm or harmed an individual. For some, trauma experiences could have been life-threatening. These experiences may have long-lasting adverse effects on people's social, physical, and emotional well-being. In a carceral environment, it is not unusual to come across individuals suffering from various forms of trauma. In a survey collected in Wales and England, researchers found that in 1,400 newly arrived prison residents, all shared 3 common childhood adversities. These adversities included 1, being abused, 2, witnessing violence, and 3, having family members who were once or are still imprisoned. Adverse child experiences are known to be a significant risk factor of negative life outcomes, such as incarceration. Yes, although it is true that many individuals may come to prison with previously established trauma, it is also important to note and remind everyone that prisons themselves are extremely traumatic. Just as someone can experience trauma throughout the duration of their time in custody, they can also experience trauma by the transition into an unfamiliar environment. This may also be known as culture shock. Transitioning into an environment in which you have never experienced anything like it, especially a prison environment, can resurface or develop new trauma. Research suggests that even the structure of the prison environment itself may induce trauma. For example, an individual's reaction to the overwhelming overpopulation of a prison, the inescapable noise, the people in uniforms with all sorts of tools on their belts, and even the lighting within a facility. These are all factors related to environmental trauma, and they are commonly present in prisons and jails. Environmental factors, such as those I just mentioned, may be especially difficult for individuals who may suffer from ongoing mental health issues and/or individuals going through substance withdrawal. Individuals experiencing current or past trauma are usually more reserved, they lack trust, and they may resort to undesirable coping strategies. However, by focusing on the effects that practitioners, service providers, and prison institutions and their staff have on individuals with trauma, we can help move toward trauma-informed practices that aim to limit additional harm to residents and perhaps even reduce the symptoms of precarceral trauma. Prisons are incredibly challenging settings, but that does not make trauma-informed practices in prisons or even jails impossible. Does it? Okay, well, the answer here is it's complicated. Vaswani and Paul note, quote, "Trauma-informed practices can be defined as individual or organizational practices that understands the prevalence and impact of trauma. that recognizes the signs and symptoms of trauma, that responds to this knowledge by revising policies, practices, and procedures accordingly, and endeavors to ensure that the response from services or systems does not re-traumatize individuals, unquote. The punitive role and impact of the carceral environment can pose a great challenge to trauma-informed practices. In a perfect world, it would be extremely wise for correctional settings to invest in educational training in effective trauma-informed practices. These practices and the subsequent care would certainly be helpful in minimizing distress and maximizing trust, ideally promoting recovery and engagement from residents with previous or current trauma. However, there is extraordinarily little known about the actual impact of trauma-informed practices when they are delivered by custodial staff, more specifically by corrections officers. This means we are largely in the dark on the science side regarding what trauma-informed practices in prison could, would, or should look like. Vaswani and Paul sought to fill this gap by talking to custodial staff about their experiences and providing guidance on how prisons can take steps to become more trauma-aware. The methods used for their research focused on the impact of trauma-informed practices within a young offender institution. The authors identified that young men in custody in these institutions reported a high prevalence of loss and bereavement. In response to this, the young offender institutions undertook a series of developmental approaches that aimed to support these young men and their experiences. According to Vaswani and Paul, this program aspired to create changes in culture, attitudes, knowledge, and understanding, while also enhancing skills in relation to working with young people with trauma. Through this program, all custodial staff had to complete a mandatory awareness-raising training. The youth institutions commissioned a pilot psychoeducational and therapeutic service to work directly with the young men affected by trauma, and they expanded the work to ensure a coherent, coordinated, and quote-unquote trauma-informed response from service providers across the institution. They also added some changes to the institutional environment, like, for example, adding fresh decor. To be able to grasp the perspectives of the custodial staff on these developmental changes, Vaswani and Paul gathered all the pre- and post questionnaire data from the 208 staff members who attended the awareness-raising training, and here are some of their findings. In the opportunities for trauma-informed practices, in the prison context, much of what Vaswani and Paul found was in relation to the role of staff and the presence of shared experiences and wider organizational change. From the staff portrayal of their daily interactions, it was clear that many believed being supportive of the young individuals with trauma was a part of their job, although it was never explicitly mentioned in their role. However, they frequently described providing emotional support and problem-solving support to the residents. Some described themselves as role models and maintained relationships that were even paternalistic or maternalistic in nature. Next, Vaswani and Paul detected the presence of a shared experience, also empathy and understanding. By widening the focus pertaining to diverse types of trauma, like loss and bereavement, there was an increase in the potential resonation by staff, and they listened to residents share their experiences. Some staff reported that these experiences triggered emotions from staff, but also created empathy and understanding, making for better conversations and nurtured relationships. Although staff identified a clear role for themselves in creating a better trauma-informed environment, the realities of prison meant that staff were up against many challenges while ensuring their interactions were truly trauma-informed. These challenges fell roughly into three categories: the challenges relating to the scale of need in prison and the associated factors related to resources, or the lack thereof, factors linked to the physical or cultural aspects of the prison environment, and issues related to the support of staff. Because of the overwhelming level of need brought by developmental changes made by the youth institutions, resources were often stretched, especially in the demand for staff time, which resulted in problematic, difficult to manage environment. Keeping individuals with trauma waiting for several weeks for support and services was less than ideal, but was in fact sometimes the norm. Additionally, the priority of the logic of control exceeded the logic of care and trauma-informed practices in these youth institutions. This left correctional staff unable to create a safe or therapeutic environment for residents. The hyper-masculine and punitive environment created a culture where being seen as tough and strong was more valuable than being seen as vulnerable. Prison staff also addressed the issues of professional support and supervision. Some felt that the sense of support for staff needed improvement. The emotional labor required of the correctional staff in a challenging environment led them to suggest a bigger need for changes within their own staff professional culture in order to adequately provide trauma-informed care approach at work. It is essential to understand the effects of trauma and the ways in which persons can contribute to additional trauma. Unfortunately, due to the historically punitive nature of carceral facilities, the authors suggest that prisons cannot be fully trauma-informed, but rather they may be able to become what the authors called trauma-aware. By recognizing the challenges and opportunities of trauma-informed practices and addressing the gaps between training and implementation, prisons can work toward creating a more supportive and healthy environment for both residents and custodial staff. Actually, for all staff. While there are significant obstacles to overcome, such as resources and prison culture, we believe it is possible with efforts made to prioritize care, empathy, and understanding. With proper support and additional training, the correctional system can foster a trauma-aware culture that will promote rehabilitation and successful reentry for individuals with trauma. As I wrap up this episode, let me also offer this resource. Check out a really informative e-learning course on the Justice Community Opioid Innovation Network, or JCOIN's webpage called JTech. The course is titled Trauma-Informed Research Through the Interview Process. While it's designed to help researchers conduct interviews with individuals experiencing trauma, it also contains a plethora of useful information about what trauma is and how anyone can talk to people with trauma. In that way, it's perfect. It's a free resource for students and or correctional staff. You can take the course anytime from your computer, tablet, or phone, and you get to earn a certificate for completing it. If you're interested, check it out on www.JCOIN-CTC.org/JTech, JTEC. And while you're there, you can peruse all the other knowledge and skill building offerings, from webinars to other courses, and you'll find the link to every season of this podcast, so there's that too. So, while you may not consider yourself a trauma expert or even trauma aware, after just listening to this podcast, do not despair. There are plenty of opportunities for you to learn more so that you can improve your own approaches to individuals with trauma and perhaps help yourself a little bit along the way. Thank you for listening to the ACEDIT podcast. We love hearing from you. So if you have comments, topics to suggest, or some research you'd like us to cover in a future season, please write to me, Danielle Rudes, at Sam Houston State University. My email is drudes@shsu.edu. And now, a whole bunch of thank yous. First, this project was supported by a grant 5PBJA 22AG00031 MUMU, awarded by the Bureau of Justice Assistance. The Bureau of Justice Assistance is a component of the Office of Justice Programs, which also includes the Bureau of Justice Statistics, the National Institute of Justice, the Office of Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention, the Office for Victims of Crime, and the Office of Sex Offender Sentencing, Monitoring, Apprehending, Registering, and Tracking. Points of view or opinions in this podcast are those of the host and the research team, and do not necessarily represent the official position or policies of the U.S. Department of Justice. Then, more thank yous. Thank you to the Justice Community Opioid Innovation Network, or JCOIN's Coordination and Translation Center, funded by the National Institute on Drug Abuse, housed at George Mason University, where this podcast originated. Thank you to our fabulous scriptwriter, SHSU Master Student Jalen Magana, and to my amazing research team at both Sam Houston State University and George Mason University. The team includes Bryce Kushmarek McCune, Sydney Engel, Caitlin Bauer, Shalom Aganaya, Alexa Mata, Chelsea Narvi, Alyssa Toman, Miltonette Craig, and Wyatt Brown. And a huge and heartfelt thank you to Jason Luton and the team at Slonky LLC for their fabulous podcast production. Tune in again soon for another episode of Aced It.